to episode 19 of the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host, Tom Mason, and today we're going to cover how to smooth putty and polyclay. You know, it's very difficult to get a nice smooth finish on either of those materials, but that is key. The number one thing, well, maybe not the number one thing, but it's a big deal to get your putty and polyclay smooth, to have that finished professional look. But before we get into that tutorial, I'd like to tell you about my new sponsor I got. It's called Sculptomo Toys. That's SCULPTOMOTOYS.com. I think I got that right. It'll be down in the description. But check these guys out. They've got some really cool high-end action figures for sale. They got stuff from NECA. It's a huge toy manufacturer. They got DC. They have Little Big Planet and a bunch more. So definitely check those guys out. To show them your support for supporting the show. I'd really appreciate that. And if you enter the promo code TMSSS17, you'll get 10% off at checkout. So really appreciate if you guys check them out and let them know that you heard about their store here on the Mini Sculpting Super Show. All right, without further ado, let's get on with the show. For today's tutorial, we'll be using two types of materials to sculpt with. We'll be smoothing out some FIMO, Greenstuff, and in order to help with that, you'll want some petroleum jelly. And then the two tools we'll be focusing on are going to be a large burnisher tool, The two tools we'll be focusing on are a large metal The two tools we'll be focusing on are a large burnishing tool made of metal. Anything will work. This is a wax 5, and a color shaper or clay shaper. This is a size 0 flat chisel, extra firm. But you can use any of the colored tips as long as they're, a silicone kind of brush thing here. Alright, in smoothing FIMO, we're gonna use these same tools as you would with Greenstuff, and let's go over some of the techniques you can use. So I've got a little ball of FIMO here on my thumb, and as you can see, a lot of fingerprints on it already. And you can use either tool to start smoothing it out. This is the metal tool, metal burnishing tool, and that got rid of most of the fingerprints right away. Similarly with the color shaper or clay shaper, you can do the same thing. Now what you'll notice, the main difference between these two tools is that on FIMO, a metal tool will actually glide across the clay much nicer and easier if it's clean. Sometimes you might have to clean it off. It can get some build up. But because the Polyclay, the FIMO, is fairly soft, the metal tool can kind of show up a lot easier, if you press too hard and whatnot. While the color shaper is a lot gentler because it's more like pressing with your finger because there's flex in it. Another factor that you'll see when you use a color shaper here is that it actually, the silicone tip, when you use it with Greenstuff or putty, it will actually glide across the material. With the FIMO, it actually grips and grabs a little bit, which sometimes is good and sometimes is bad. And I'll show you how to handle that here in a second. Okay, so let's add some material real quick. So I'll pinch off a little bit from this little blob I'm keeping down here to keep it warm, because polyclay is a little easier to manipulate when it's closer to your body temperature, or at least a little warmer. So there's a little blob there. Now you can see there's a large seam all the way around. Now I could go in right away. Actually, let's put a little more. I want to put a little more material on there. So I'm just going to put a little bit on my thumb, or my finger here. And we're just going to pinch off a little. This is how I add clay usually. I'll have a little bit on my thumb or my index finger here, and you just cut a little off, put a little on. You usually want to try and add larger amounts at a time so it doesn't take you forever. But as you can see, it makes, you know, kind of a mess. There's all these little seams and you're starting to try and blend them together. Well, the number one tip I can give you to smoothing out your material and getting things nice and clean is actually just use your finger. Now with this said, you can use just the finger by itself, but it will work much better if it's oily in some way. So you could actually touch, you know, your nose or your forehead, something that has a little bit more grease, and you can just start spreading. Now you do have to be careful because this can deform the overall shape, so you want to do this at a very early stage when you're just doing the major forming of the miniature. You can also, this is debatable because you might be getting a little bit of clay particles, but you can actually lick your finger, which or even use water. But you can see now that that is almost completely blended together. There's still a little seam around there for the large part, and that's mostly because I just can't get my finger down to that area. So we'll move on to a tool. So you can use the metal tool to just start slowly rotating around, and you typically want to, so this is the material I put on second, and so it's moving up and down towards the original material this way. So because this material is on top of this material, you typically want to push out away from the secondly added material to blend it down into it. You can, and sometimes you do have to go back on, but if you do this before it's blended down in the direction of the new clay, it can actually end up pulling up and creating more of a ledge. See, I kind of exaggerated there, but you get the point. So you do that here and there. And this is what I use for a majority of my polishing with FIMO. Now, you can also, there will also be times where you want to use the color shaper. And that works too, and actually be more helpful for smoothing because it will actually grab and drag the FIMO a little bit better. But sometimes, like I said, you don't want to grab so much, and that's where, again, you do the same thing, where you need to get a little bit of grease on it, push and pull down, and there you go. It just like smoothed in like butter. All right, that's it for the main techniques. Now let me show you a demo. Now at the very base level, Greenstuff is smooth very similarly to Polyclay. Well, Greenstuff in any putty. So what I've got here is I've got this small amount of Greenstuff, and I just went ahead and kneaded it up just as normal, you know, pulling it apart, pushing it together, and set it on my thumb, just so you could see a lot of this. You get a lot of folds and crevices that form with Greenstuff, and you see that more than you do when you work with Polyclay, and it's because of the gumminess of it, and how sticky it is. It likes to hold together like that. So again, the number one technique you can do to start smoothing when you're roughing in the main form is to use your finger, but it doesn't work quite as well as it does on the FIMO. I just licked my finger there so you can see that, but it can get a nice general shape going. And it does wipe away a lot of the fingerprints, although depending on how hard you press, you can actually get extra ones on there. So, well, then what do you do next? Well, you might have your metal burnishing tool, and you can smooth this. It totally works, but it's very sticky. And unfortunately, I am maybe a little too practiced with this, or maybe it's that I've just smoothed it with my finger and got a little oil on it. And obviously saliva, but your metal tools have a tendency to stick, so it's very hard to just burnish without really pushing and pulling the material. So what you do in that circumstance is that's where the Vaseline or the petroleum jelly comes in. I'll show you how to use this in just a second. First, I want to add just a little bit of extra putty just to kind of mess up the surface a little bit more, like we did on the last when we were working with Polyclay. Okay, there's some really gross seams that we need to clean up and smooth out. Okay, so what you do, the way you use Vaseline, it's very important you don't use too much. So what I do is I take a little bit, that's actually way more than I need even, so I'll put a little bit back. And I just like to spread it on my hand, right there. Anywhere works. If you want, you can use a little towel, sponge, a different part of your hand, but you just want to get a little amount on there. And I like to do it over here because there's a lot of area, and I can spread over here. So you just dab a little bit on your tool, and that's actually too much. So we actually want to rub it off on a clean part of the hand, like that. So you really can't see it, but there is a film of Vaseline, and then I'm not sure how easy it is for you to tell, but my tool is just sliding over this. Even with that little amount, it just makes it super easy to slide over the putty, which with those very extreme seams actually is too slippery to deal with. That's why when you're first starting to manipulate down, you need to do as much as you can with your finger, like I showed you if it's a large area, but if it's a small detail area, you will have to use a burnisher, and you start to try and pull the seams together. So see how I'm letting the tool kind of grab. Let's see if I can focus a little better. So the tool is kind of grabbing and pulling the material up. And now I'm going to pull and grab it down. It's just because I'm letting it just very gently stick to the tool. And it takes some practice because it's very easy to push too hard and oh crap, it stuck to my tool. You see? So if that happens, you just have to rub it off with your finger. That's another key, huge thing, and it's not really as much of a problem with FIMO. Sometimes you have to wipe off your metal tools, but with Greenstuff, it's very easy for putty to get stuck to it, and if that happens and you're trying to smooth it, it's almost impossible. So you need to keep this very smooth and clean. Okay, so I've showed you that and how it can work, and usually when you're using the Vaseline, that's kind of when you're doing your last bit of fine-tuning and smoothing. Now, that's the way I did it for years until I discovered these clay shaper or color shapers. These are amazing when you're working with putty. And the reason why is because of the silicone tip. It does not stick to the putty. And it's almost the perfect amount of like adding this to your metal tool, adding the Vaseline or the petroleum jelly to your metal tool. It's the perfect amount where it's not too slippery. So if you push a little bit harder. It's not actually grabbing, but I don't know, there's just enough there that you can start seeing it move the putty around and smooth it a little better, and you never have to worry about lubrication. Just to step back one more time. For lubrication, this is a great thing to do, although it can get overly slippery. And as gross it is to say, other great lubrications are grease from your face, or I typically grab it from my nose or sometimes my forehead, or you can use saliva, but again, don't use too much, and you will be licking your tools and handling this material, so not necessarily the best idea. You can also use water, but that can you have to be very careful. You almost have to put a little too much on to get it to actually help, but if you do too much, it can get under the putty, and that becomes an issue. So I've never liked using water, but there are people that do. And if you do use water, a nice tip is to actually have a sponge with some water on it rather than like dipping it in water, because that will get way too much, but just to get a little damp. But if you have a clay shaper, that can alleviate a lot of your problems. But you will have to use metal tools, because there will be times that you're just going to have to get in. We're not going to use this, but if you have a little metal probe or your knife, and you're just going to have to do little details with the metal tools. Anyways, you can see here, as I'm smoothing this out, it's starting to blend together very nicely. And yeah. So it's all about slowly working the material. But the biggest thing with putty, as I mentioned in the beginning, is when you saw those large seams, let's see if you can tell, they're still kind of there. You can see on that side there's actually one. It's very important. You have to do as much as you can before you use like a clay shaper or overly lubricate your metal tools. You've got to kind of pull and try and blend those together, even if it's a little ugly, like this is now. It's not a good smooth ball shape or anything. But that seam is now almost gone. And I'll just rub it with my finger one last time to kind of bring it all together. And the reason you have to do all this on FIMO or putty is that you've just got to get this. The best way to make your sculpts smooth is to get them smooth in the beginning. A lot of beginners will try. They'll smooth it some, and then they'll start putting in details, and then they're like, "Oh crap! I've got to smooth this out. It's very rough." And once you have details in there, it's very hard to get your sculpt smooth. You have to do the smoothing when you have a large area that you can just make nice and even. Okay, I'll go show you a demo of sculpting and smoothing with Greenstuff. I wanted to share one more thing before closing the show, and that's to let all of you know that I'm on my way to Adepticon on Thursday. So I'll be there from Thursday evening all the way through Sunday, leaving Chicago on Monday. So I really hope anybody that's watching the show that's going to be there, keep an eye out for me. I'll be teaching 2 classes. There's still a couple spaces left in those. One on Friday, one on Sunday rather. So be sure to check those out if you can attend and are interested in taking one of my personal classes. So, but more than that, I just really hope that I get to see lots of people that are interested in miniatures and sculpting specifically there at the show, because it's a really fun convention, and I would love to kind of have a revival of the sculptor meetup going on. That's only going to happen if we start congregating at these conventions again. So if you're at the show, post in the comment and maybe we'll run into each other and we'll try and hook up. All right, thanks a lot for watching and keep sculpting.